If you ever decided to just stay home with your family for a holiday because you just feel like you go out all the time and you're constantly traveling and you'd actually just like to be home with your family for the holiday, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button. What's up, y'all? It's 4th of July week, and I decided to stay home for the most part, so we really didn't do anything big, and it was great. I needed the time off. I needed to be able to just sit down and relax for a day and not have to think about anything and do anything and analyze anything. But here's a quick montage of my little gathering at the house. We didn't shoot any fireworks. We just pretty much enjoyed each other's company. Put some burgers on the Traeger, smoked them, and then finished them off on the grill. That being said, it's now past the holiday, and I analyzed a lot in retrospect, which I started working on new songs and stuff. So that's why I started analyzing things, which, I mean, it happens. I have had quite a few conversations with people recently that really made me think about the fact that I am much older than most of the people that I either work with or around. And it was over some like very basic things, like things I really honestly didn't really think about. One of them being, I got asked how I started to learn how to play guitar or music in general, and one of my first instruments was piano. In reality, I was self-taught, but I quickly transitioned because I was always curious about guitar. So when I first got my first like really cheap guitar, I was learning how to play, and there was no books or instruction, nothing really made sense. I didn't know where to go get information to teach myself. Thing that I did is I got records, like physical records, 45s specifically, and I would listen to records, and just, there's little grooves on a record where you have to put it on the groove to start that track. So you have to count the grooves, get to the groove of the track you want to listen to, set it in that groove, it'll start to play. When you get to the end of the song, it goes to a new groove. If you scratch the record, it'll skip back or forward depending on the scratch. But the point is, when I would first learn how to play guitar, I would have to listen to records and physically put the song that I wanted to learn or listen to on, let it start playing, and then based off of those first few notes, I would attempt at figuring out matching the guitar note on my guitar to what I just heard. There is no rewinding on a record. I was trying to explain this to somebody because in a digital age, or a more modern age, even with cassette tapes, you could rewind. You could push the rewind button and go back a couple seconds. You hold it down longer, you could go back even further. but you couldn't really find the beginning of a track. You just kind of guessed how far back you would rewind. There was no standard. It wasn't like CDs where you can rewind by holding the button down, or you can actually go back a track by hitting the button and going back, and it would just start at the next track, or the same track over from the beginning. No, back in the day, you just listened to an entire song all the way through to figure out what that one note was, and then you would do it again. And then you would play the song again. I would literally try to figure out songs by listening to them over and over and over, piece by piece, just to get the one note. Like if it was a quick little lick, say like a little 4-bar lick, with like a little note progression that was a little simple lead line, like da-da-da, I would listen to it to figure out every one of those da-da-da, and I would just repeat the entire song to get to that lick. And in most cases, I would try to listen to songs where I noticed the lick repetition in the song, because then it wasn't like I had to restart the whole song to hear that part again. I would just wait for it to play again later on in the song, and then try to match the note that I was playing to that. It seems dumb, and it seems very time consuming, which it is very time consuming. It's not very dumb, because in the long run, I developed an ear where I can listen for notes, and now I can associate them. I'm not always right, and one of the more interesting things about that ability is, yes, I did learn how to note associate on a guitar to an album, like the sounds, the physical notes. Something that didn't occur to me too much later is that I didn't necessarily develop the ability to listen to that note and then figure out the exact note. Now what I mean by that is, there's many octaves on a guitar, and sometimes you have the same note and the same octave very close together. I would know the right note to play, but sometimes when watching the way that somebody would play the song live, I noticed that I was hitting my hand on the fretboard in a different spot than the actual guitarist. What that meant is, I was playing a different octave version of the same note. And through doing this, essentially playing the songs incorrectly based on the original way the song was played, but playing it correctly for note for note, I developed my own way of playing. I was essentially playing songs wrong. If you wanted a one-for-one clone of the way somebody played the song, I was playing it wrong. If you wanted the song to sound correct, I was playing it correct. What that helped me do is develop my own way of playing, because I would listen to these songs, play them in my way, playing along to them, then occasionally get to watch a live video or go to a show, watch the guitarist play live and go, oh, his hand doesn't move where my hand does when I'm playing. And what this also did is it helped me hone my eye-hand coordination of what I do, because I started realizing that I was doing it different than like some of my favorite guitarists. But it was just kind of interesting to talk with somebody that didn't even have the concept of doing that. They grew up younger than me, so they grew up with digital technology, and they were able to just like put a digital song on their computer, and then when they got to the part they wanted to hear, they would pause it and just drag a little bar back and then play it again to hear that same part again. And I did not have that ability. I mean, I have that ability to do that now, because I use iTunes and I use Logic for my recording, so like I have that ability now. I did not have that ability then. That's the interesting thing. Yeah, very much made me feel old. In another conversation I had with somebody, I was just referring to payphones, like 1-800-COLLECT. Back in the day, when you didn't have any money, you would call 1-800-COLLECT on a payphone. And for those that don't understand, there would be a phone randomly out in public, like right there where that pole is, just a phone for no reason. In reality, it'd probably be at that gas station. That's more likely. There'd be a phone or a series of like 2 to 3 phones all next to each other with little bump outs, which were like little walls, kind of like a bathroom stall, but like a mini bathroom stall, so that you could have a little bit of privacy while you were in there on the phone if somebody was next to you on a phone as well. But they had these bump outs, and people would go up to them, and if you needed to make a phone call, because nobody had cell phones, well, in reality, people had cell phones, but they weren't as commonplace as they are now. I think I just realized I'm being trailed by a police officer. I really hope he turns, because I don't plan on going fast. I'm like barely kind of trucking along. Actually, I might need gas. I did not check for that either. Nope, he's turning. Popo. I've been pulled over twice on a motorcycle ever, and both times were on this BMW. One time, the officer only wanted to talk to me about the bike. Turns out the officer actually lived close to me, and he knew where I lived when he saw my license, not my license, but my license. He knew where I lived once he saw my license and struck up a conversation. And back then I had a Harley that I would park outside, and he was asking me about the Harley. He's like, yeah, I always saw this Harley that I liked. I'm like, yeah, that was my Harley that got stolen, which is how I funded this purchase. Yeah, and after a little bit of a talk, he let me go. Just a warning. Wasn't really a big deal. Second time was on Valentine's Day. I got an emergency call in the middle of the night, and I needed to go help somebody. Jumped on the bike. I guess I ran through a stop sign that I did not mean to, because it was on a downward hilled slope. So I actually stopped and kind of rolled, I guess, what do they call it, California rolls. I did that. 3 officers and a state trooper pulled me over. I ended up having to call my wife because I didn't have a copy of my insurance on me, so she's on speakerphone guiding me through the process. And this officer and the state trooper are arguing with me about how motorcycles work, and that I should have just slammed my foot on the brake when I was sliding down this hill, and I would have came to a stop. And me trying to tell them, like, yeah, on a motorcycle on 2 wheels, you slam on your brake and you immediately stop your forward momentum, and both tires want to just drop to the ground. You're not steering your way out of that. You're not just going to stop like a car. A car is steady. You're going to just fall down. And they didn't like me having to explain physics to them. And I think ultimately that is why they let me go, because in reality what they were telling me to do was technically, if I followed their direction, would be in danger of my life. Potentially a lawsuit there. Don't know. Yeah, they let me go. And I went off and helped my friend. Yeah, but back to what I was talking about being old. So, there used to be phones on the corners, at gas stations, and almost any major business you went to. There would just be a phone there. And, yeah, you could use that phone if you had a quarter, or a dime, or a nickel, or a couple of quarters. For the most part, people probably remember that they costed a quarter or 2 quarters. Typically, you would put 1 quarter in to make a call that would be a couple minutes, say about like 2 to 5 minutes. And if you wanted to talk longer, you had to keep adding quarters to get a longer amount of time. Kind of the way that like a parking meter works. If you've ever had to park somewhere where you put your coins in so that you can add money to add time for how long you're going to be parked there. Kind of like that, but to be on the phone. Yeah, I had to explain to somebody that I wanted to find a vintage one of those. And it's funny to say vintage, because in reality, in my mind, I'm picturing them as metal. Like straight a piece of metal with the phone on it. And I thought it'd be cool to have that as like a vocal recording booth, where like that, I guess the microphone would be the actual phone itself wired up. It was a thought. I think I could figure out how to make it happen. I'd have to find one though that I could convert over. And it just kind of turned into this thing where like I have no idea where to find one of those. I did a couple years ago. I looked at a house that part of it was the house came with a glass phone booth. One of the old glass phone booths. The house came with it. And I ended up not being able to get that house because it just didn't fall within my range at the time. Everything was so hard to get. That's a couple of years ago. I'm saying like 2013 or something. It's way different now. Probably even harder, to be honest. But yeah, trying to explain to somebody what a phone booth was when they have no concept, because they, in their entire adult life and most of their youth, from even before they were a teenager, they spent with a cell phone. They don't have an idea of what a phone in public is, much less how to use one. And never mind trying to ask them how many phone numbers they have memorized in their head. Because back in the day, you memorized every phone number that you actually really needed. So when you went up to a phone, you already had it in your head. Nowadays, I know my phone number, roughly, and I know my wife's. I can recall those two out the gate pretty quickly. Outside of that, I would actually have to open up my cell phone to look up the number, and it just takes way too many steps. You're going to the contact, you're pushing info, then you're scrolling down to look at the number saved on the contact. And it's easier to just push on the contacting column, realizing that you're older than the people that you're surrounded with. It's kind of a surreal moment. It makes me wonder that if at one point me talking about tube amps to somebody will be like an antiquated idea or thing. Because I love playing tube amps, and I've been recently diving into this world of digital modeling and plugins that model amps, and I'm really looking for something, honestly, just to make my life easier for like demos and for live tracking in the room. If I want to record drums and I'm working with somebody that, say, is a drummer, and I want to play along with them on guitar, well, I want to record their drums in real time, but I don't want to have my guitar bleed over into the drums. So I don't want to use one of my amps really loud and, have it mic'd up and it'll still bleed a little bit in. I want to get like just the raw drum takes without any guitar in it. And the room I'm in, you see where I record, it's one giant room. So the drums sit in the center behind the mix station, and I have my amps to one side and my bass amps to the other. So if we were jamming live, there would be bleed 100%. So it just makes me wonder, like, I'm looking at all these digital modelers, and they make digital model pedals. Universal Audio makes the Woodrow, models a Tweed amp. They make the Ruby, which models a Vox amp. And they make the Dream, which I believe models a Fender Deluxe. Oh, and I believe they also make what they call the Lion. That one models a Marshall. And then there's other things like the Boss IR2, which is a model. It's an amp modeler and cabinet modeler with an effects loop. So you can have two presets of two different types of amps that you want to use. It has an effects loop built in, so essentially it works just like a real amp. So you can record everything you want to record, play live. If you use an effects loop with like delay or a little bit of modulation or reverb in your effects loop, you can actually throw it in the effects loop of that, and it will run that through as if it's going between the preamp and the power amp, which is actually pretty cool. And I've heard good things about it. Downside is I heard they're also really hard to find and not really for sale. But when I learned about that, it kind of opened up my eyes, like, well, in previous videos I've talked about trying out Kempers and also trying out Quad Cortex. And then there's a new one that just came out called the Tone X. I don't know the company that makes that. I think it's called like Hub Amp or Amp One or Amp Tone, something like that. I've seen videos pop up on my YouTube for it. But I don't know how I feel about trying to get like an amp modeler and a pedal. Because part of me is like, I already run Universal Audio Apollo, which is the recording interface. I run a rack. And within that, it has the ability to put your guitar direct in, and you can actually run it through their version of these amps, amp emulations that model real amps. And they sound pretty good. They're not the best. They do sound, to me at least, a little digital. They lack that feeling that you get of an amp going through a cabinet with the air physically pushing against the microphone, they lack that feel. And that's something hard to explain to people. But in the long run, if you're just demoing out an idea, or you're actually mixing it into your mix. So say you recorded, one guitar in, the amp you did use, you put a microphone on it, but it was too bassy, too whoopy, or too high. You can actually duplicate that guitar line and then make it, like, essentially reamping it in your DAW so that you can have a secondary guitar line, but you can use one of these other amps and then modify it that way. Most of the time what you would do is you would record your guitar in direct and then just add whatever amp you want to use. Like, it's essentially like a plugin. You just play with it, add it, try it out. You don't like it, try a different one. And I own a couple of those. I don't use them very often, but I do own a couple. But it made me really think, like, why don't I just I already have that ability to do that. And Universal Audio does make their own version of Marshalls, Friedman, Engel, a couple of Sewers, and Fucks. Not cussing, I believe it's called Fucks. Could be called Foops. I'll pop a picture up in the corner here. But why don't I get something like that where I can just use those? So that's kind of in my mind that maybe that would be convenient for me to use for demoing, especially when I don't feel like really like putting up microphones on a guitar cabinet and dialing in the tone right there, because that A, takes time, me pulling out microphones, but B, sometimes I have those microphones already set up on something else and I want to leave them there because I actually want to use them on whatever I'm doing. Like, I'm in the middle of recording another session, I'm in the middle of recording a song, or even recording tones to try to mix into something else, and it's just an experiment with that amp specific. I will have microphones already up, and I'll take a break and then try to be like, yeah, I got an idea for a demo, but the demo idea I have is high gain rock, and the amp I have is my Gibson Skylark mic'd up. Not the same kind of amp, not the same kind of feel, not the same kind of vibe, so I need to fix that. So it made me start thinking about how I wonder if just amps by themselves are going to be antiquated technology. Because I know a lot of people in modern days now are recording music, and they're not even using real amps. They're using all sorts of modelers that model the real amps. And it's so funny that there's even tape modulation. And when I say tape, I'm not talking about like sticky, like Scotch tape. I mean like old school cassette tape that you would use in a cassette player, just a little bit thicker, on a reel-to-reel, made a certain type of sound on old recordings, and they would use that. They use an emulation of that sound on recordings now. It's so wild when you start looking into these things. And it's interesting to me because I'm listening to a lot of demos of amp modelers, and where, yes, my ear is trained enough to know the difference between these digital processors and a real tube amp in front of me. But a tube amp mic'd up really well with EQ and everything kind of on it, where it's been processed enough to be in the mix of a song, and you A/B that with a modeler, which for the most part, the modeler is eliminating the EQ at the desk. It still has EQ on the amp, but the desk, meaning the way you recorded the sound, we EQ things into a desk to get a sound. For the most part, some people I know are purists, they don't do that. But if you're EQing from a desk, that's how people don't realize when you listen to an old album like Queen or Led Zeppelin, and people obsess over trying to get that Led Zeppelin guitar tone, or the Queen guitar tone, or Metallica's guitar tone, or Megadeth's guitar tone, or Slayer's guitar tone. A lot of people don't take into account that it's not just the amp and the guitar. It's also the microphone that was on the amp, the room the amp was in, the reflection of the sound of the amp in the room back to that microphone being picked up from different angles. It's that microphone going through a cable into a preamp. It's that preamp going into an active EQ on a recording desk. It's that active EQ going into a physical rack unit compressor. All these things add up and make the way that sounds. So when you think that you're copying that guitar tone from some classic album, I mean, in reality, you're never getting there. They're going through all this equipment. And now, unless you know that exact chain, and here's the kicker. A lot of that equipment was so old and used at that time that it was broken in and had a sound at that time. And it probably is still used today and doesn't sound like that now. So even if you had that exact same compressor, EQ, recording desk, it's probably been worked on and probably sounds entirely different than it did back then. So you running what you believe is the same guitar amp, same cabinet through all that equipment, it might be just slightly off. You might be really close. I'm sure you could get really close. But in the long run, it probably doesn't matter. It's completely different. That was a big epiphany for me in the past year. Instead of obsessing over my guitar sound, I've taken an approach where I just want to get a good sound, and then I just want to mix it. How is it going to work in the mix that I'm doing? Is it going to sound cool? Is it going to sound good and full? In reality, I don't need to sit there and try to make my guitar sound really amazing to me in the room or with me sitting directly in front of the speakers. I want to make it sound good in the mix. And for the most part, if I make it sound good in front of me, I can polish that to make it better and tighter once I start mixing it. So for me, it's kind of the 80-20. You got to get 80% there, and the other 20% kind of doesn't matter. If I can get my guitar tone 80% there, I'm going to have it sit in the mix well once I'm mixing it. And when I'm not mixing it, when I leave it raw, like the video that I just did of the Klon, those tracks are raw. I didn't edit any part of those tracks other than their pan left, their pan right. You're listening to two different microphones, both pan left and right. There's no EQ going to a desk. There's no compressor. There's no compression from a compressor. It's literally just what it is. You're listening to it the way I tracked it. And I purposely did that to give you guys an idea of how that sounds. Because it's inevitable. If you're curious how that Klon is going to sound, or the Klon sound is going to go onto a track, well, I'm still recording tracks. I'm still working in the studio. That's not stopping anytime soon. So it's inevitable that the more you follow my channel and listen to things, you're going to hear that Klon on more things, and you'll hear the way it works within the context of a mix. So I just wanted people to hear that raw sound as close as it would be in their own ears if they were in front of my amp specific, which is also a very rare thing. I do understand that not everybody has a super rare Marshall cabinet or a super rare Gibson combo from the 60s. I get it. But it'll give you the idea of how that pedal would sound through, say, like a vintage Tweed type of amp, or how it would sound tightening up a dark, more metal sounding amp. That was kind of the reason I did that. And I think it worked well. Like, I actually like the tones I got, and I didn't work hard at getting the tones. I just kind of basically dialed up, standing in front of it, and pushed record. So, very minimal time spent working with it. Just kind of went like, it's either going to sell itself once it's recorded, or it's not. And honestly, I think it really did sell itself. Like, it sounds good. And the irony is, when I listen back to me playing the Jeff Beck modded Klon Archer into my Gibson Skylark, I actually really liked the tone of my Skylark clean without any pedal, which is why I got that amp. I like the amp, how it sounds. But it really just occurred to me that a lot of the, I guess, analog music gear, recording gear, a lot of it might just be antiquated. I might not be talking to people in the future that would know what it is. I mean, as it stands, a lot of these things are plugins that just mimic the physical devices, and people don't even know. They know how to use the plugin, But even then, there'll be a plugin where they moved all the parameters around. Same knobs, completely different location. And there are people that bought those plugins and know how to use them in and out. And then you give them a physical unit like an 1176. And the knob's in a different place, and they're just like, oh, yeah, if that does the same thing as the one I'm used to, and they do it. And they actually got the knowledge. They know how to make it work. It's pretty interesting. Alright guys, thank you for joining me on my rant. If you like listening to me rant about being old, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button. Turn on notifications. I'm not telling you that just because you happen to be old. I'm telling you that because if you do that, it helps me out, lets me know I'm doing something good, and it helps me keep putting these out there for you guys. Alright. Remember, pull hard, play hard.